Hi guys, welcome to today's session. This is going to be a new series following on from the multimedia still life that I just finished. And we're still going to be working in still life for this one, but we're now going to be working in oils. So you can see this is my kind of general working setup. I've got a piece of canvas that's sort of taped and stapled to a board, just one of my working boards, which is often a good way to start a painting before you stretch it. Kind of saves the time to stretch, especially for something that's more of an exercise like what we're working on today. It's going to be an exercise in color and primarily texture. So I'm doing a still life copy of a lemon, and you guys, when you're working on your own, could do any type of fruit. I recommend just doing one fruit, so we're just studying a single piece of fruit, kind of looking at its texture. You could do a bunch of different fruits as well, because everything has a different quality. So apples will have a certain texture and sheen versus a lemon, which is what I'm working from, versus grapes, for instance. And they all have their particular characteristics and kind of color profiles. So obviously this is going to be quite yellow, quite lemony. It's quite a yellow lemon that I'm working from. So I've got the reference up on the screen already that you can see. That's just a simple setup in my studio. And today we're going to be working in burnt umber and using just mineral spirits to create a wash drawing, which you've probably seen me do a few times before if you've watched more of the OCAD courses that are up here. So wash drawing is basically just using some paint. So I've just got some burnt umber on a white canvas, and I'm using a kind of medium-sized flat brush, and I'll be primarily using it on its edge, which will give me a kind of nice straight line. So when I say on its edge, using the kind of flat of the brush, the belly of the brush, means I'm using kind of the kind of wide part of it. But if you do your brush strokes using the thinner portion, you can create quite nice controlled lines. And it's a System 3 acrylic brush, moderately stiff bristles. They're not like the softest bristles, but they're not quite as stiff as proper like hog bristle would be. So the aim of today is to just get the lemon roughly placed, shadow shapes in the lemon roughly placed, and the shadow of the lemon on the ground plane, for instance. So I'm generally going to be using a little bit of medium in my cups, and you can sort of see me mix over here. So kind of like a semi-liquid paint is what I want to use. You can sort of see if I do that as an example, sort of the kind of fuzzy, fairly light line that we can get. It's easy to work over, easy to erase. We'll be talking a little bit about erasing and using mineral spirits later in the session. So to begin with, I want to kind of block roughly how much of the image the lemon is going to occupy. So I've put my complete reference up, and I'm not necessarily working specifically to those proportions. I'm probably going to zoom in a little bit more, I think, on the lemon. So my starting point is just going to be to kind of figure out, you can sort of see just rubbing there with the brush, how wide I want my lemon to be. And I'm just kind of exploring with these brush strokes here. So that's going to be my overall width. I've dropped the right hand side a little bit lower because the kind of the widest point on the right of the lemon is a bit lower down than the widest point on the left, which is that little kind of extra bit that sticks out at the back. Then I want to place the top of the lemon, which is a bit more to the left, you can see. So even in this kind of initial placement, I'm starting to give a little bit of the gesture of the lemon, and then the bottom of the lemon, which sits about there. So I've created something that's a little bit like if I kind of hover over it, you can see it's almost like a little kind of rectangle that is the bounding box of the lemon. And then these are the furthest left, right, and top and bottom points. So from there, I then also want to figure out roughly where my ground plane is going to go. So I know that the ground plane drops sort of a little bit below halfway up the lemon. You can see that in the reference quite easily. And I also want to just have a kind of general idea where the shadow is going to drop below the lemon as well. And the kind of right hand edge of the shadow drops kind of in line vertically with that edge of the lemon. The right hand edge of the shadow seems to sit a little bit further to the left up here. Yeah, and that roughly gives me sort of overall construct. For keeping it really simple, I can see that the shadow on the lemon is maybe a bit taller than the shadow cast by the lemon. Angling back up a little bit, so starting to get more of a sense of the structure of the lemon. But as I say, still using these very, very basic blocky shapes. And I barely used any paint as well. So that all seems pretty good. I can also see that on the lemon, the shadow on the form of the lemon, so if you've watched some of my videos about form and three-dimensionality, or any of the other videos about painting or drawing that kind of go into rendering, we want to divide the light and the shadow of the lemon. The shadow of the lemon is very clear. You can sort of see this boundary in the reference between shadow and light. And keeping it simple, the shadow on the right-hand edge roughly lines up with that horizon line, which is kind of useful. So that's where that shadow would go, and then it kind of starts to just angle back up if we're keeping it pretty general. Tilts up to the left, and then a little bit higher again, where that little extra bit juts out. And that's approximately our shadow edge on the lemon. And we also want to now find the boundary of the lemon. So keeping it simple, there are some little juttings back and forth, but we maybe won't quite get to them just yet. We've got that section there, which then the little shape of the ground plane that isn't in shadow cuts in. We've got another shape starting to kind of find the shape of the shadow, which obviously matches approximately the shape of the lemon. And again, that also angles back up almost sort of parallel to that shadow there on the lemon. And again, another little shape that juts out. You can see for a lot of these strokes I'm just using pretty much the shape of the brush. And then we need to leave enough width for this little angle back. And then if I start working over the top, and dropping back down to this edge, we've roughly got most of the shape of this lemon now blocked in. So you can see it's really started to emerge. And another thing I'm going to pop in, because we've got it pretty well suggested, is the division between the base of the lemon and the shadow on the ground. So we've got that in as well. And that's not too bad. So the next thing I want to do is start filling in these shadows, just lightly, so just kind of hatching them in. There are different ways you can use the brush, so sometimes I'd use the flat of the brush with some medium, but kind of felt like doing it this way today. It's a little bit more like drawing, so it kind of shows you the wash drawing aspect of it, and just generally how you can kind of go about drawing in paint. So there you can see I've now divided the light shape from the dark shape of the lemon. I'm also going to go in, and the background in this reference, I've used like a black card background. It's pretty dark, so I'm going to put that background in as well, because it's going to help distinguish the light shape at the top of the lemon from the background quite early on. And that's not too bad. We're going to have an opportunity to go in and amend this stuff, any of these shapes next week as well. But now that I'm roughly happy with that shape, I can go in and properly paint. So now I'm starting to paint a bit more. Still using that same brush. The background's a bit darker than the shadow of the back, kind of value of the background's a bit darker than the shadow on the lemon. So I'm going to leave that, I'm going to keep that the case. Using a fair amount of medium now. You don't have to worry too much about the exact types of brush strokes you're doing. At this sort of stage, you're going to be working over the top. You can keep it kind of fairly loose, is generally quite nice. And sort of even it out generally. And then the shadow below the lemon is also pretty dark. So I can go in reasonably dark burnt umber here, kind of separate it out from the shadow of the lemon. Just working within those simple boundaries still. We're going to go in a moment and kind of refine this wash drawing a bit and push some of the values and so on, but we're just still feeling out the general shape. Excuse me. So just plotting the general shape still, then we'll go in and kind of amend those near the end. So that's not too bad. I'll also just kind of not go quite as dark, but just even out the tone in the lemon. Yeah, it's not too bad. And I might just push the other tones a little bit darker. They can actually go even darker. We're going to probably push the background and the shadow below to about as dark as the burnt umber goes by the end of the session. We're going to move that way sort of gradually, so that way we're always in control of our values. We don't have to do as much removal, kind of editing that way. And just kind of gradually build stuff up. Being oil paint is fairly easy because obviously it's going to stay fairly wet as we work. It's not going to stay as wet as if we were using, not using the mineral spirits as our solvent mixture. Because that's the evaporation of that is going to speed the drying process a bit. But it will still be fairly quick. I'm going to go in and go just a bit darker yet. The shadow below. Yeah, it's not too bad. So the final thing I want to do today is go through and just kind of be a bit more specific with the edges of these shapes. So using pure burnt umber and a smaller kind of little detail brush, just going to go in and work the edge of this line a little bit more precisely. Particularly at this edge of the shadow on the lemon, there's a lot more kind of breaks in the line than we have from the original block-in. So the original block-in is is intentionally simple, and then we can go in and just kind of correct it. Not even correct necessarily, I'm just kind of adding to the detail, so just working over that line that existed before. And I can do the same. The shadow on the floor actually is probably not too far off how much detail we want with it. So I'm just amend that bit slightly. As I say, it can stay fairly loose, what we're working on here. We want a reasonable distinction between the bottom edge of the lemon and shadow on the ground plane. So I can go in and kind of darken that a bit. That's probably going to be probably the darkest bit of the painting there. That's definitely kind of worth making pretty dark at this stage. And if I want to lighten anything off, so just as an example of kind of lightening, I can take, if I take a semi-clean brush, so I just sort of wiped off that early brush that I used. If you sort of rub it over the surface of the paint, you can kind of pick it up. And it's a bit like erasing, so that's sort of how you can go about erasing tone. So if we want to go kind of lift a little bit of the tone on this lemon here. You can also shift the paint around a bit, so I'm kind of rubbing the paint away from that kind of center of the lemon shape. I just want to get rid of this halo that's formed around the top of the lemon. Just going a bit darker generally with the rest of the background. As I said earlier, we can start to push all that stuff a bit darker now that everything else is kind of roughly in place. So I'm pretty much using more sort of pure burnt umber now. Just going to generally patch and darken this. It doesn't have to be super neat. It's actually kind of preferable to a certain extent if it's a little bit rough, because that gives a nicer texture below the subsequent layers of paint that we're going to put on. So yeah, that's sort of made the background a bit more irregular, so it feels less like there's a halo specifically around the lemon shape. Yeah, generally that's not too bad. That's about the level of finish we need for our wash drawing. Any kind of wash drawing is the same, so it doesn't really matter what the subject is. We're just using fruit as a very easy to access but quite interesting subject that you should be able to kind of replicate yourself at home. But yeah, that's pretty much it for today's session. That's all we're going for. You just want to block in your general shape, general shadows, so I've divided the light shape of the lemon with the dark shape of the lemon, shadow on the ground plane, and the background is quite dark. The foreground plane is actually pretty dark as well, but I've kind of left it light to separate out, and then next week when we start to kind of colour this in with local colours, we'll sort of figure out the exact value of those portions of the piece. But for now, something like this is a kind of rough block in is all you're after. So yeah, that's it. As always, you can follow the link through to OCAD to subscribe and get tuition from myself and other expert tutors. And otherwise, just subscribe to the YouTube and you'll be able to follow videos and kind of have a look at all the different stuff that's going on. So yeah, I'll see you guys soon.